Hello and welcome back to Survive France, the podcast where I tell it like it is, warts and all, about anything and everything related to life in France. So this morning we're talking about renovation costs and in particular how to keep them from spiralling out of control, which is something that comes up time and time again on the website, and it's often because people have moved here and perhaps for the first time ever they're tackling a really big renovation project. And also, obviously, they're doing it in a foreign language, so not easy. So hopefully this morning, some of the things I'm going to cover will be helpful to those of you, lots of you, who are renovating in France or even thinking about renovating in France. So obviously, buying a house in France for many people, it's a dream come true, and it's often the result of a long kind of love affair with the country, the people, and the lifestyle. But just like any relationship, any love affair, things can go wrong, and property renovations, just like relationships, can turn sour. And it's often very stressful, and tackling a project in an unfamiliar environment, a place where things are done differently, can prove incredibly difficult. And I think one of the main areas of concern for people renovating French properties is knowing just how much everything is going to cost. You know, obviously, renovation projects can and invariably do throw up incredibly expensive surprises. Having said that, if you do some really careful research and planning at the outset, it should make the whole process far less stressful. And you'll note that I said should, because this isn't a given by any means. So, obviously, ideally, nobody would ever think about buying a renovation project without having first gone through a really detailed budget for that particular property. But back in the real world, we often fall in love with an individual property and convince ourselves that, yeah, the renovations can be done really quickly, easily, and it won't cost that much. So sometimes this is true, but more often than not, I think signing the acte de vente, which is the moment when you go to the notaires and finally sign on the dotted line and the house is yours, it marks the start of a new relationship, a long and expensive relationship with your local DIY store, and probably a relationship with your bank manager as well, where you're constantly asking for a little bit more overdraft, or yes, I need to move some more money again this week. So, even for people who are in the enviable position of being unconcerned about how much the renovation is going to cost, I think it's still really important to have a handle on the finances and to be able to calculate the difference between the renovation costs and the final worth of the finished property. Because you might not have any plans to sell at the moment, but circumstances can change. Tell me about it. And it's always really bad practice to have spent more money on a property than you'll ever be able to recoup. So yeah, I mean, obviously property prices can rise, but you need to have base your calculations on present market values and get an idea of what it's worth spending on any particular property. So, for instance, some properties in towns or on small housing estates, which are called lotissements, or even in certain regions, are always going to have a ceiling price. And this means that however much you spend, you're never going to be able to exceed that price. So that's not the end of the world, but it's something that you need to be aware of. So I would say when you're starting to think about costing things out, you need to start by listing all the absolutely essential things that you need to do to a property. And now every project is obviously going to be very different, but there are some common elements, so we're going to run through these. So the first one to probably think about is the services. Are, services such as water and electricity accessible and on the property? Then you need to look at the structural condition. What you need to do, what remedial works are required, the condition of the roof. Is there any insulation? What about the windows and doors? Is there a heating system and plumbing? Does it need upgrading? Probably. What about the internal walls, internal woodwork or joinery, bathrooms and kitchens? it's even if there is a bathroom and a kitchen, it's really unlikely they're going to be up to your kind of personal standards, or even, fairly modern standards. They might be livable with, but it doesn't mean that you're not going to want to replace them. And then finally, the floors and the floor finishes. And again, there might be a flaw. It might be those lovely little tiny brown tiles that seem to be, everywhere in older French properties and look like they've come from a public toilet. They're on the floor, they're tiles, you have a floor. Do you want to live with them? You've got to think about all this stuff. You then need to look at all of these elements in detail and break down what needs to be done, and think about whether you can do the work yourself, or are you going to need to employ a professional or professionals. And if you're planning to tackle the work yourself, then you need to research material costs and labour time, and be realistic, as there's nothing worse than setting over ambitious deadlines for yourself, which become impossible to meet. And this is really stressful and super demoralising. Try to get more than one estimate if you're using workmen or artisans. This is easier said than done, because doing an estimate or a devis takes people a lot of time and effort, and a lot of artisans are unwilling to quote for jobs that they either don't want or have no plans to do in the foreseeable future because they're already booked up. So it is easier to say than do, but if possible, try and get more than one quote. And with all this research and information, you should be able to create a fairly accurate figure for each element of the project. Now, once you've costed out the essential parts, then you can think about the less essential aspects, which I would say include things like landscaping, although it is quite essential because you can't live in the middle of a kind of building site forever. And it's an important thing to plan for and tackle at the outset. If you are going to landscape and plant trees and garden and things like that, the sooner you can get stuff in, the better it will look, the faster it will get established. But it's something you can sideline if budget is a constraint. You need to think about, do you want to put a pool in eventually? Decoration, the outbuildings, if you're going to do something with those, whether you need to because they're about to fall on your head, or whether you would just like to. If there's a garage, is there a loft or an attic? Do you want to use that space, convert it? When are you going to do that? How much is it going to cost? So all of that needs to be thought about, noted down, and prices added to each kind of particular element of the build. Now, the next stage is to look at all those elements of renovation costs that are very, very easy to overlook, but can significantly add to your budget. So things like, you might need drawings for planning permission or to give to contractors. You will need to connect utilities such as gas, water, telephone, electricity. All of these costs need to be factored in. You're going to get costs, you will need to contact the appropriate supplier and request a personalised quotation. Generally, it's not a huge amount of money, but we did once buy a property up a track and then found out that EDF were going to quote us €60,000 to connect us to the grid. So, like I say, listen to this podcast so you don't screw up in the way that I've been screwing up for the last 23 years. Learn from my mistakes. Anyway, we did get that one sorted in the end, but it was massively stressful. So think about all of those things. Think about clearing the site before work can begin. That in itself will be a cost. You've got to think about soil removal costs, plant hire, tool and equipment hire or purchase. What are you going to buy yourself? What are you going to hire? And at that point, you can then start to draw up a budget and work out how much the renovation is going to cost globally. And I would say at this stage as well, once you've got your kind of outline, then you can break it down and make a checklist for each aspect of the project and get accurate costings for each element. So really start from ground zero. Start by noting down ground level, site clearance and plant hire, and utilities. and then we can go from there. At ground level, you also need to think about concrete and aggregates. The costs of both of these elements have gone up massively in the last few years. A septic tank, or, soak away, ground drains, a ground source heat loop if you're thinking about that for your heating and cooling system. Then look at the structure. So that includes structural work, repairs to walls, lintels, insulation, render, pointing, whether that's external or internal insulation, obviously. Render, pointing, timber, treatment of timber, replacement of timbers. Then you've got the roof and the windows. You need to look at the roof trusses and the timber. Is that a full replacement job, or can it be patched up? Roof tiles, roof insulation, then the windows and internal doors, roof lights or Velux if you've got them or are planning to install them, and then all of the kind of rainwater goods, gutters, downpipes, etc., etc. Then you come on to plumbing, heating and electrics. You need a heating system if there isn't one there already, or if there is it going to be sufficient? You need to think about pipes, hot and cold water feeds, sanitary ware, bathroom, sink, shower trays, appliances, water tanks, waste pipes, cables, sockets and switches. All of these things seem kind of quite small, plug sockets, but you need lots and they cost a fortune now. And really spend time planning how many sockets you need, and always put in more than you think you'll need, because you will need them. Then you can look at the internal walls and woodwork and think about, dry lining, insulation, staircases, floorboards, partition walls, doors and door furniture, skirtings, windowsills. Once you start thinking about everything, every element that's in a house, there's a lot to factor in and a lot to either install or replace. And it's all doable, but it does all come with a cost. Then we get onto bathrooms and kitchens, and we've got to think about baths, toilets, sinks, taps, shower bases, cubicles, shower controls, towel radiator if you want one, basin wall units in your kitchen, doors, drawers, handles, worktops, appliances. It's a lot. And the budget, I think, on kitchens and bathrooms can easily spiral out of control. You start thinking you'll do something cheap from IKEA, and then you add X, Y, and Z, and this and that and the other, and wouldn't it be nice to have that instead? And before you know it, you've spent an absolute fortune. So be careful on that one. If you really want to blow the budget on your dream kitchen, and why not if you've got the budget, I would suggest doing the basics and doing it in a kind of, timed process. So you think, right, well, we'll do this first because that's essential. And then at the end, if we have X left, then we can do Y. It's not an ideal solution, but we are talking about trying to keep a handle on the budget here. Then there's decoration, whether that's wall tiles, floor tiles if you're not having floorboards, paint, paper, floor finishes, whatever it is. Again, you might not have the budget to install exactly what you want to do at this point in time, but that's okay. You can live with things for a bit and do it gradually, and wait till the sales are on and there are bargains to be had, and do your research. And if you want that hardwood floor, wait till it's discounted, kind of thing. Again, I've done that, been there, done that, got the t-shirt, and it can be grim, but it's doable. And then outside, we need to think about if there's a garage, or you want a garage, ditto a pool, landscaping, paving, terraces, drains. And, I mentioned previously the extras such as plant hire and tools and drawings. It's very, very easy to just forget how many different elements of each different job you will require tools and equipment for. So the more planning you can do, the less, they won't make it any cheaper, but the less you're going to be taken by surprise. And there's a wealth of information online these days and in the French construction press, which will enable you to calculate the costs of pretty much everything, each individual job. And any major French DIY store such as Conforama, Castorama, IKEA, Leroy Merlin will be able to give you up-to-date pricings for kitchens, bathroom fittings, Velux windows, doors and whatever. And many of these stores can also put you in touch with approved artisans who will provide quotes or even have a kind of discounted relationship with the store for doing the installation work. Now, obviously, at this planning stage, you don't need to decide on the type of taps you're going to install, but if you can put a figure into the budget, it will help you control the costs. And if you want super expensive all singing, all dancing taps, that's fine, but you need to account for it from the outset. And this way, when you come to buy the taps, you will notice if you're going to blow your budget on the taps. Don't know why I've got to think about taps, but I have, because we've very often bought relatively kind of cheap taps, and it's a false economy because they are pretty crap, to be honest. Build quality is not great these days unless you go expensive. Having said that, some are so expensive you can basically install a basic fitted kitchen for the same price. So do your research when it comes to taps is my advice. And a little bit of excess here and there is okay, but if it keeps happening, you are going to end up blowing your budget. So with all these figures in front of you, you're now going to be able to calculate your overall renovation cost. And now you need to look at whether this is feasible, both in terms of your personal budget and the eventual finished value of the property. And you'll be able to see if you can afford all the different elements, and then you can make a decision as to whether this is the right renovation project for you. So, for example, a couple who've got a really keen interest in gardening and who've also decided that installing a swimming pool is absolutely non-negotiable. It's essential for them. They might look at the figures and decide that they would rather buy a property that doesn't need a new roof, as this part of the renovation cost is going to absorb their landscaping and pool budget. Another couple might realise they have the money to complete the project, but only to a basic level of finish, and decide to opt for a smaller property, say, that they can then finish to a more luxurious level. And this all comes down to your personal preferences and priorities. So making your renovation making your budget work is all about doing your research carefully into the costs at the outset and then keeping an eye on the figures as you go. There are always going to be costs that are coming at slightly more or less than you allowed for. And this is why it's vital that you keep updating the budget throughout the build process as you get quotes in, as items are bought, and as bills are paid. There will always be areas where you're able to make savings, but I have to say that for most of the major structural elements, such as, the roof, walls, floor joists, and so on, these costs are pretty much fixed as a kind of average per square metre cost. And that is your figure that you're going to have to stick to. You can shave a bit off sometimes by doing the work yourself, but it's the sort of overall cost of the raw ingredients. I didn't want to say materials again, if you like. And I would say you also need to allow a healthy contingency fund of at least 5 and ideally 10% of the overall renovation budget, which will help you to cope with any unforeseen circumstances. And because, even if you've costed the project out down to the last euro, there will still be expenses that are totally out of your control. And rising raw material prices due to changes in oil prices are one example. Laws can change regarding TVA, which is equivalent to VAT, can change. And of course, old buildings are notorious for throwing up unexpected problems. So, overall, renovating property is hard work and it can be super stressful. It can also be really good fun, incredibly rewarding, and it lets you get your French home exactly as you want it. But if you can ensure that you are aware of all the costs before you start, this should make the renovation process slightly less daunting, more manageable, and certainly less stressful. So all I can say now is bon chance, or good luck. Now, there are a few other extra tips that I'm going to pop into the article, which I will be posting on my Buy Me a Coffee site. I'll pop a link to that in the show notes. Lots of you have very kindly been in touch over the last few weeks, months, and offered to support the podcast and the website, which is just lovely. So I've set up a Buy Me a Coffee page, and if you'd like to donate, then that would be very much appreciated. Thank you, as always, to our fabulous sponsors, Fab French Insurance. Without them, this podcast would never have happened, would never have got off the ground. I do personally have all my insurance policies with them. Their service is unbeatable. I cannot recommend them highly enough. So as you start your renovation work and you need to insure your French property, don't forget about Fab French Insurance. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been useful, and do feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions. Thanks again, and see you next time.